The small town of Rachel, Nevada, was nothing extraordinary at first glance. It was a place of dirt roads, scattered trailers, and a diner that served as the heart of the community. Life here moved slowly, the desert stretching endlessly in every direction, with the jagged peaks of mountains on the horizon. But Rachel wasn't just any town, it was the closest settlement to the infamous Area 51. For years, the residents had grown accustomed to the stories, UFO sightings, strange lights in the sky, and the ever-present hum of government secrecy. Most shrugged off the tales as nonsense, but for Jack Carter, the rumors held a strange allure. A young mechanic in his late 20s, Jack had lived in Rachel his whole life. His days were spent fixing dusty trucks and broken-down cars, but his nights were filled with dreams of uncovering the truth. It was during one of those quiet nights that Jack first noticed something was off. He had been working late in his garage when a low, pulsating hum filled the air. At first, he thought it was one of the planes from the base, Area 51 often tested experimental aircraft. But this sound was different, more rhythmic, almost alive. Stepping outside, he scanned the sky, expecting to see a jet streaking overhead. Instead, he saw 3 bright lights in a perfect triangle, hovering silently in the inky blackness. The lights moved in unison, gliding over the desert before vanishing without a trace. Jack's heart raced. He wasn't a man prone to flights of fancy, but this was something he couldn't explain. The next day, Jack mentioned the incident to a few regulars at the diner. Old Joe, a retired Air Force mechanic, gave him a knowing look. "You saw the lights, huh?" he said, sipping his coffee. "You're not the first. And you won't be the last." "What are they?" Jack asked, leaning in closer. Joe shook his head. "Don't go digging where you shouldn't, kid. People who ask too many questions around here have a way of disappearing." Jack laughed it off, but the old man's words stuck with him. Over the following weeks, he started to notice other strange things, strangers in black suits asking questions, odd vehicles parked on the outskirts of town, and, most unsettling of all, the growing number of people who seemed to vanish without a trace. The hum returned several nights later, louder this time, and with it came the unmistakable feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the lights in the sky were connected to the disappearances around town. The hum had grown louder each night, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to settle in his bones. Even his tools rattled on the shelves of his garage, as if responding to the sound. Late one evening, as Jack locked up the garage, a black sedan pulled into the dusty parking lot. The car was immaculate, its dark paint reflecting the faint glow of the neon sign above the diner across the street. A man stepped out, dressed in a crisp black suit and wearing sunglasses, despite the setting sun. "Jack Carter?" the man asked, his voice calm but commanding. Jack felt his stomach knot. "Yeah, that's me. Can I help you?" The man smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "We've heard you've been asking questions. Seen some unusual things." Jack crossed his arms, trying to appear unfazed. "Rachel's a small town. Strange things happen here all the time. You a journalist or something?" The man's smile faltered, and he took a step closer. "Let's just say I work for an agency with an interest in maintaining order. People who stick their noses where they don't belong can cause disruptions." Jack's heart pounded, but he forced a casual shrug. "Look, I'm just a mechanic. I don't know what you're talking about." The man reached into his jacket, and for a moment, Jack thought he was reaching for a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a small, rectangular device with a single red button. Holding it up, the man said, "It would be in your best interest to forget what you've seen. Stay away from the base, and stop asking questions." Before Jack could respond, the man pressed the button. A sharp, high-pitched sound erupted from the device, sending a piercing pain through Jack's head. He stumbled back, clutching his ears, as the world around him seemed to blur. When the noise stopped, the man was gone. The sedan had vanished, leaving no tire tracks in the dirt. Jack staggered back into his garage, his head pounding. He knew he should let it go, pretend none of this had happened. But his curiosity burned brighter than ever. He sat at his workbench, staring at the tools scattered before him. Whatever was happening in Rachel, it was bigger than the lights in the sky or the strange hums at night. And if the man in black thought he could scare Jack into silence, he was sorely mistaken. That night, Jack made a decision. He would find out what was happening at Area 51, no matter the cost. The following days brought more questions than answers. Jack began to notice subtle changes in the town, strangers loitering near the diner, unfamiliar cars parked along the edge of the desert, and locals acting unusually quiet. Even old Joe, who was normally the first to spin a yarn about the base, avoided Jack's gaze when he asked about the man in black. One night, restless and unable to sleep, Jack decided to drive out into the desert. The hum had returned, louder than ever, vibrating through his truck's dashboard as he drove along the empty road. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but something deep inside compelled him to keep driving. The desert stretched out endlessly, illuminated only by the pale light of the moon. As he drove, he noticed a faint glow on the horizon, pulsing, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Jack pulled over, killed the engine, and stepped out into the cool night air. The glow came from a ridge in the distance. It wasn't natural, no headlights, no campfire, just an otherworldly radiance that seemed to beckon him closer. Grabbing a flashlight and a wrench from his toolbox for protection, Jack began walking toward the light. The desert was eerily quiet, the only sounds his boots crunching against the gravel and the occasional gust of wind. As he climbed the ridge, the glow grew brighter, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. Finally, he reached the top and froze. Below him, nestled in a shallow valley, was a fenced-off compound. It wasn't on any map Jack had seen, and it didn't look like part of the main base. Small buildings with angular designs surrounded a central dome that shimmered with the same pulsating light he had seen from afar. Figures in black uniforms moved in and out of the buildings, carrying strange equipment. Jack crouched low, his heart pounding. He had always known there were parts of Area 51 that weren't meant to be seen, but this felt different. The air seemed heavier here, charged with an unnatural energy. As he watched, a truck pulled up to the compound, its headlights off. The rear doors opened, and two soldiers dragged out a figure, a man, bound and gagged, struggling against his captors. Jack squinted, his blood running cold as he recognized the man. It was Tom, his old friend who had disappeared weeks ago. Jack's first instinct was to shout, to call out to Tom, but he stopped himself. If they caught him, he'd be next. Instead, he slid back down the ridge, careful not to make a sound, and ran back to his truck. As he drove home, his mind raced. Whatever was happening in that compound, it was far worse than he had imagined. And Tom's presence confirmed one thing: the disappearances in Rachel weren't random. They were connected to the base, and now, Jack was in too deep to turn back. The next morning, Jack couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen at the compound. His friend Tom, bound and helpless, surrounded by men in black uniforms, what were they doing to him? Why was he taken? Jack's mind buzzed with questions, and he knew there was no way he could sit idly by. He headed to the diner, hoping to find someone willing to talk. Old Joe was already there, hunched over a cup of coffee. Jack slid into the booth across from him. "Joe," Jack began, lowering his voice, "I saw something last night. Near the base. A compound I've never seen before." Joe looked up sharply, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced with tension. "You were near the base?" he asked in a harsh whisper. "I saw them," Jack continued. "They had Tom. He's alive, but they've got him. Do you know what's going on?" Joe hesitated, glancing around the nearly empty diner. The few other patrons were absorbed in their meals, but he still leaned in closer. "Listen, kid," he said quietly, "you don't want to get mixed up in this. I've been around long enough to know that people who dig too deep into the base don't come back the same, or don't come back at all." "What do you mean?" Jack pressed. Joe sighed heavily, his weathered face etched with worry. "Back in the 70s, I worked maintenance for some of the testing sites around here. Saw things I can't explain. Lights in the sky, strange sounds, equipment malfunctioning for no reason. People went missing, just like Tom. The official story was always the same: transferred, retired, moved out of town. But I knew better. Some of them, they weren't the same after they came back. Eyes hollow, like something had been taken from them." Jack shivered. "What's happening out there, Joe?" "I don't know," Joe admitted. "And I don't want to know. But if you've seen too much, they'll come for you, too." The words sent a chill down Jack's spine, but before he could respond, the diner's door swung open. A man in a black suit stepped inside, scanning the room. Jack froze. The man's gaze landed on him, and he smiled faintly before heading to the counter. Jack felt the blood drain from his face. He slid out of the booth, muttering a quick goodbye to Joe, and hurried out the back door. When he returned to his garage, he found the door slightly ajar. His tools were scattered across the floor, and his workbench had been rummaged through. Someone had been inside. Jack's hands trembled as he grabbed his wrench, but there was no one in sight. On the bench lay a single sheet of paper, neatly folded. He unfolded it and read the words scrawled in bold, block letters: "Stop asking questions." The message was clear, but Jack's resolve only hardened. If they thought a scare tactic would stop him, they were wrong. He had to find Tom and uncover the truth, before it was too late. Jack knew he couldn't stay in Rachel much longer. The message left in his garage wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. Whoever was behind the disappearances wanted him silenced, but the thought of leaving Tom behind was unbearable. As night fell, Jack prepared for what he knew would be his riskiest move yet. He packed a small bag with essentials: a flashlight, a crowbar, a few bottles of water, and a camera. If he was going to infiltrate the compound, he needed proof. The world had to know what was happening in the shadows of Area 51. He parked his truck a mile from the ridge, cloaking it with a tarp to blend into the rocky terrain. The desert was eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath his boots. The hum, however, was louder than ever, reverberating through the air with a sinister persistence. Jack reached the ridge and crouched low, scanning the compound below. The same buildings were there, their lights glowing faintly. The central dome still pulsed with that unnatural light, but something was different tonight. More trucks lined the perimeter, and the guards seemed agitated, moving briskly as if preparing for something. Jack's stomach churned as he slipped down the ridge, careful to stay in the shadows. He reached the fence and found a section that looked weaker than the rest. Using the crowbar, he pried it open just enough to squeeze through. The air inside the compound felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. Jack moved between the buildings, keeping low and out of sight. He ducked behind a stack of crates as two guards passed by, their voices tense. "Can't believe they're activating it tonight," one said. "After the last failure?" "It's a risk," the other replied. "They're confident this time. Besides, the subject won't last much longer." Jack's blood ran cold. Were they talking about Tom? He waited until the guards disappeared, then crept toward the dome. Up close, the structure was even more unsettling. The walls were smooth and seamless, as though it had been carved from a single piece of material. A faint hum emanated from within, matching the vibrations Jack had felt for weeks. He found a service door on the side of the dome and tried the handle. Locked. Using the crowbar, he managed to force it open just enough to slip inside. The interior was dimly lit, the air heavy with an acrid, metallic scent. Wires snaked along the floor, leading to a central chamber surrounded by thick glass walls. Inside, Jack saw a figure strapped to a table, Tom. His friend's face was pale, his eyes closed, and his body restrained by heavy metal bands. Machines beeped and whirred around him, their displays showing incomprehensible data. Jack's heart pounded as he snapped a few pictures with his camera, then moved closer to the chamber. He pressed his hand against the glass, willing Tom to wake up. Suddenly, a loud alarm blared, and the room was flooded with red light. Jack spun around as footsteps echoed in the distance. The door he had entered slammed shut, locking him inside. From the corner of his eye, he saw Tom's body jolt violently, as if struck by an unseen force. The machines around him erupted in a frenzy of noise, and the hum reached an unbearable pitch. Jack's instincts screamed at him to run, but before he could move, a voice crackled over the intercom. "You shouldn't have come here, Mr. Carter." Jack's blood froze as the disembodied voice echoed through the dome. The hum intensified, vibrating the very walls of the chamber. His eyes darted toward Tom, who convulsed violently on the table. The machines around him sparked, casting eerie shadows across the room. "You've interfered with classified operations," the voice continued, calm and detached. "You'll soon understand the consequences of curiosity. Let him go." Jack shouted, his voice barely audible over the deafening hum. He pounded on the glass separating him from Tom, but it was impenetrable. The intercom crackled again, and the voice turned colder. "Your friend has volunteered for a noble purpose. His sacrifice will advance humanity's understanding of the unknown. You, however, have become an inconvenience." Suddenly, a section of the dome's wall slid open, revealing a group of guards in black uniforms. Each carried a sleek, futuristic weapon aimed directly at Jack. "Stay where you are," one of them barked, his tone brooking no argument. Jack glanced around desperately, searching for an escape route. His eyes landed on a control panel near the chamber housing Tom. If he could just reach it. Before the guards could react, Jack darted toward the panel, weaving between equipment as they shouted for him to stop. He reached the controls and began frantically pressing buttons, hoping to disable whatever was torturing Tom. The hum shifted, and the lights in the room flickered. A surge of energy pulsed through the chamber, and Tom's body arched unnaturally. His eyes flew open, glowing an unnatural, piercing blue. "Jack," Tom gasped, his voice distorted, as if two voices were speaking at once. "You have to, run." The guards hesitated, their weapons trained on Jack but their attention divided between him and the spectacle unfolding in the chamber. The intercom voice spoke again, but this time it seemed shaken. "Deactivate the system. The subject is unstable." Tom's body convulsed again, and the glowing light from his eyes spread, coursing through his veins like liquid fire. The glass around the chamber began to crack, and a low, guttural sound emanated from deep within him, a sound that was not human. Jack's instincts screamed at him to flee, but he couldn't leave Tom behind. "I'm getting you out of here," he shouted, frantically searching the control panel for anything that looked like a release mechanism. Before he could act, the chamber exploded outward in a burst of energy, sending Jack flying across the room. He hit the ground hard, his ears ringing and his vision swimming. When he managed to sit up, the scene before him was chaos. The guards lay scattered, some motionless, others groaning in pain. The equipment was destroyed, and sparks rained down from the ceiling. In the center of the destruction stood Tom, or what was left of him. His body was wreathed in a shimmering aura, his features distorted and alien. His glowing eyes locked onto Jack, and for a moment, there was a flicker of recognition. "Jack," he said again, his voice softer now, but still layered with that unnatural tone. I can't control it. You have to, stop me." Before Jack could respond, the doors to the dome burst open, and more guards poured in, their weapons drawn. Behind them stood a figure in a pristine white lab coat, his expression one of grim determination. "Neutralize the subject," the man ordered. The guards hesitated, clearly terrified of what Tom had become. Jack scrambled to his feet, placing himself between the advancing soldiers and his friend. "No. He's not your experiment anymore," Jack shouted. The man in the lab coat fixed Jack with a cold stare. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. Stand aside, or you'll share his fate." Tom's distorted form twitched violently, and the room shook as if the earth itself was responding to his anguish. Jack's heart pounded as he realized he was out of time. Whatever they had done to Tom, it was tearing him apart, and Jack was the only one who could stop it. The room was chaos. Tom's body writhed in agony, glowing with an energy that seemed to draw power from the very air. The guards hesitated, their weapons still aimed but their faces pale, a mix of fear and confusion washing over them. Jack could see their uncertainty, they weren't sure if they should fire or wait for orders. But Jack knew that if Tom lost control completely, no one would be safe, not even the soldiers. "Stop this!" Jack shouted, his voice hoarse from the adrenaline pumping through him. He didn't know how, but he had to reach his friend. "Tom! You have to fight it." Tom's glowing blue eyes fixed on Jack once more, though his expression was becoming more alien by the second. His mouth opened, but instead of words, an unnatural screech tore through the air, causing the walls to vibrate. "Jack, please, help me," the words came through, but they were fractured, as though someone else was speaking through Tom's voice. The man in the lab coat stepped forward, his face a mask of cold calculation. "You've seen too much. All of you. It's time to end this experiment before it escalates further." He raised his hand, signaling the guards to advance. "No!" Jack shouted, stepping forward. His heart pounded as he realized that these men weren't interested in saving Tom, they were more concerned with containing the damage. Tom's body twisted again, and this time, the energy surrounding him grew to an unbearable intensity. The hum in the air became a roar, and Jack could feel the floor beneath his feet shaking violently. Suddenly, the lights flickered out, and the entire room plunged into darkness. Jack stumbled, his hands reaching out for any solid surface. His flashlight flickered back on, casting a weak beam of light across the room. Through the dim glow, he saw Tom, his body now suspended in midair, surrounded by an electric blue aura. The guards had backed away, panic visible on their faces. The man in the lab coat, however, remained unfazed, watching the scene with a detached interest. "Get away from him!" Jack shouted, feeling a surge of protectiveness for his friend, even in his transformed state. Tom's voice reached him again, but this time it was no longer his own. The voice was harsh and guttural, like a growl from deep within the earth. "You should never have come here, Jack. You've opened something you don't understand." The words sent a chill down Jack's spine, and the air around him seemed to thicken. He was no longer in the lab, standing in front of his friend, he was standing in the presence of something ancient, something not of this world. The guards, realizing they were out of their depth, raised their weapons. But the lab coat man held up a hand to stop them. "No, it's too late for that," he said coldly, almost as though he were speaking to himself. "We've pushed the subject too far. The experiment was never meant to go this far." Jack's confusion was growing, but his need to protect Tom overtook it. "What did you do to him?" he demanded, stepping forward, his voice laced with anger. "Why are you experimenting on people? Why my friend?" The lab coat man glanced at him briefly before answering. "Tom was never meant to be a subject. He was a volunteer, yes, but not for this. His bloodline, it carries something unique, something we didn't anticipate. The energy he's now channeling, it's ancient. It's not just alien. It's something far worse. The words hit Jack like a ton of bricks. You're telling me, this has nothing to do with aliens? The man shook his head. Not in the way you think. We were searching for answers, yes, but not just about extraterrestrial life. We were looking for something older. Something hidden within the human genome. And Tom, he's the key. His bloodline holds the potential to unlock doors that no man was ever meant to open. Suddenly, the lights came back on, blinding Jack for a moment. When his vision cleared, he could see Tom's form once again, now hovering at the center of the room, his body completely still. The glowing blue aura faded, leaving a dark, ominous emptiness where once there had been light. Tom's eyes remained open, but they were no longer glowing. Instead, they were dark, empty, as if the life had been drained from them. His face was pale, his body limp in the air. Jack's heart sank as he realized what had happened. Tom was gone. Not in body, but in soul. Whatever had been awakened within him had consumed him entirely. No, Jack whispered. No, Tom. The lab coat man's face was unreadable. The subject is no longer viable. The experiment has failed. He looked at Jack, his eyes narrowing. But you may still have a part to play in this. Jack's fists clenched at his sides. I don't want anything to do with this. The man's expression remained cold. You'll change your mind, Jack. Soon, you'll understand that there are no more choices left. The air in the room had grown cold, and the silence that followed Tom's transformation was oppressive. Jack stood frozen, staring at his friend, at the empty shell that had once been Tom. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had Tom truly been taken over by something alien? Or was it something older, as the man in the lab coat had said? You'll understand soon enough, the lab coat man repeated, his voice calm but chilling. This isn't over. This is just the beginning. Jack's anger surged, but so did his fear. What had they done to Tom? What had they turned him into? And why was this man, this scientist, so certain that Jack was somehow involved? The guards began to move toward him, their weapons still drawn. Jack took a step back, his body tensing in preparation for a fight. He didn't know what he was up against, but he knew he couldn't let them take him, too. Stay back, Jack warned, his voice low and steady. I'm not going anywhere with you. The lab coat man raised a hand, signaling the guards to halt. Let him be. He won't escape. He turned to Jack with a cold smile. You think you can leave this place, don't you? That's what you want, isn't it? To walk away, pretend you didn't see anything. Jack's heart pounded as he realized the truth, the man wasn't going to let him leave. He had become part of something far greater than himself, something he didn't understand, and there would be no walking away. I'll never stop looking for answers, Jack spat, his words filled with defiance. The man's smile faltered for a moment, but only for a moment. You'll have to find them, then. He turned to one of the guards. Prepare the containment room. He's ready for the next stage. Before Jack could react, the guards closed in on him. But then, the world seemed to explode in a blaze of light. The air rippled around them as an intense force, unseen but palpably real, shook the compound to its core. Tom's body twitched, his eyes flicking open once again. The blue light began to return, but this time, it was different, darker, more malevolent. Jack's heart leapt into his throat as he watched his friend rise into the air, his body floating eerily in place. The hum, once faint, now reverberated through the entire structure, growing louder with each passing second. It's too late for him, the lab coat man said, his voice barely audible over the noise. But for you, Jack, the door is still open. You don't understand what's coming. What Tom has unleashed. Jack could feel it then, the shift in the air. The compound, once sterile and controlled, was now something else. The walls seemed to pulse with the same dark energy that surrounded Tom. It was as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. The guards began to shout, their voices filled with panic as the lights flickered once again. One by one, the machines in the lab powered down, their screens turning to static. Jack's senses were overloaded, the floor shook beneath his feet, and the walls seemed to bend and warp. But it wasn't the facility that was changing. It was the world around him. Jack could feel it in his bones, a sense of disorientation, as if the very laws of nature were being bent by an unseen hand. No. No, this can't be happening. The lab coat man looked at Jack, his expression unreadable. You wanted to know the truth, Jack. You asked for it. Now you'll see what happens when you open a door that was never meant to be opened. And with that, the world began to collapse. The walls of the facility cracked and crumbled, the sound of breaking concrete filling the air. Jack barely had time to react as the floor beneath him split open. He fell, his body tumbling into the darkness below. As he plummeted, the last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was Tom, his friend's face twisted in agony, his body now fully consumed by the alien energy, floating above the wreckage, his eyes locked on Jack's. Jack, Tom's voice echoed through the void, but it wasn't his voice anymore. It was something else, something far older. The last thing Jack heard before everything went black was a whisper that would haunt him forever. Run, while you still can. Jack's body slammed into the cold, hard ground, the impact leaving him breathless and disoriented. For a few moments, all he could do was lay there, gasping, trying to make sense of the chaos that had unfolded around him. His mind was a storm of confusion and terror, his body aching from the fall. The screams of the guards and the terrifying hum of Tom's transformation still reverberated in his ears. When his senses returned, he slowly pushed himself up, his surroundings unfamiliar and foreboding. The once sterile, clinical environment of the facility was gone. He found himself in a dark, cavernous space, an underground labyrinth of tunnels and ancient stone walls. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. The walls seemed to pulse, as though they were alive, as if they were watching him. The tremors from earlier had subsided, but the eerie silence that had replaced them was almost worse. The only sound now was the distant echo of his footsteps as he stumbled through the dimly lit corridor. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, each beat reverberating in his ears. Where am I? He didn't know how far he had fallen, but he was no longer in the lab. The facility, the sterile equipment, the cold-eyed scientists, it was all a distant memory now, swallowed by the darkness beneath the surface. Tom, Jack whispered to himself, his voice hoarse and raw. The image of his friend, transformed beyond recognition, haunted him. He couldn't understand what had happened, what had taken over Tom. The energy that had consumed him was unlike anything Jack had ever encountered. As Jack moved through the tunnel, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally, and the faint sound of movement echoed around him. His instincts screamed that something was watching him, waiting. Suddenly, a flicker of light caught his eye. A faint glow from the end of the tunnel. Without thinking, Jack quickened his pace, his legs burning with the effort. He didn't know where he was going, but he had to get out. He had to find a way back to the surface. When he reached the source of the light, he was met with an unexpected sight. At the end of the tunnel was a massive door, ancient and covered in strange symbols. The glow seemed to emanate from it, but it wasn't natural. It was the same eerie blue light that had surrounded Tom before his transformation. The symbols on the door pulsed, as if alive, as if the very door itself were breathing. Jack hesitated, his hand hovering over the cold metal. Something told him that whatever lay behind that door was both his salvation and his damnation. But he couldn't turn back. Not now. With a deep breath, Jack pushed open the door. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the cavernous space as he stepped into the room beyond. What he found inside took his breath away. The room was massive, its walls covered in more strange symbols. In the center stood a towering structure, an altar of sorts, surrounded by glowing stones. The same blue light that had consumed Tom now filled the room, its energy so strong that Jack could feel it in the pit of his stomach. It was as if the room itself was a conduit, channeling an ancient power. At the altar was a figure, draped in tattered robes, its face obscured by a hood. Jack couldn't see its features, but he could feel its presence, cold, ancient, and malevolent. The figure turned toward him, its movement fluid and unnatural. "You have come," it said in a voice that echoed through the room, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Jack's heart skipped a beat. "Who are you?" The figure's head tilted, as if considering his question. "I am the keeper of the door," it replied. "And you, Jack, are the key." The words sent a shiver down Jack's spine. The key? What did that mean? Before he could respond, the figure raised its hand, and the blue light intensified, filling the room. Jack staggered back, his vision blurring as the energy pulsed through him, threatening to overwhelm him. "You are the one who opened it," the figure continued, its voice growing more forceful. "The door was meant to stay closed. But you unlocked it. You allowed it to escape." Jack's breath caught in his throat. "Escape? What are you talking about?" The figure stepped forward, its presence growing more oppressive. "The energy you see, the power that took your friend, was never meant to be harnessed. It is an ancient force, beyond comprehension. And now that it has been released, it cannot be contained." Jack's mind raced. Was this what Tom had been consumed by? Was this the true nature of the experiment, the thing that had been awakened beneath Area 51? The figure reached out, its hand cold as ice. "You cannot stop it, Jack. But you can delay the inevitable. You can choose to stop it here. But to do so, you must make a sacrifice." Jack's pulse quickened. "What do you want from me?" The figure's hand hovered near Jack's chest, and for a moment, everything seemed to go silent. "Your life," it whispered. "Or the world's." The room seemed to close in around him, the energy so thick it was suffocating. Jack felt as if he were being pulled into something dark and endless, as if the very fabric of reality was tearing apart at the seams. He knew the figure was right, the door had been opened, and whatever had been unleashed could not be contained. But the choice the figure presented was one he couldn't comprehend. His heart raced, and his mind screamed for an answer. But as the figure's hand reached for him, Jack knew that the fate of everything, his friend, his world, rested in his hands. Jack's mind was spinning. The weight of the figure's words pressed down on him, suffocating him. "Your life, or the world's." It felt as though time itself had come to a standstill. Every breath he took seemed to echo in his ears, and every beat of his heart thudded with an increasing sense of urgency. The figure's hand hovered mere inches from his chest, and Jack could feel the coldness of its presence, as though the room itself had become a tomb. The blue light pulsed, throbbing like a living heartbeat. The air around him was thick, as if reality itself was bending, warping under the figure's power. He could feel something ancient, something dark and primordial, awakening, something that had lain dormant for eons, waiting for the right moment to break free. Tom's face flashed in his mind, his friend, the one who had once been so full of life, now lost to the monstrous force that had taken him. Tom had been the first casualty, but Jack realized with horror that he might not be the last. Whatever the figure was, whatever this force was, it was hungry. And it wasn't done yet. "Please," Jack breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "What is this? What are you?" The figure tilted its head, its hooded face still hidden in shadow. "I am but a servant," it replied. "A keeper of the door. The door that should never have been opened. But you, Jack, you are the key. You have allowed what was never meant to escape." Jack's mind raced. He wanted to understand, to find a way out of this nightmare, but every instinct screamed at him that this thing was beyond comprehension. The door he had opened was not merely a physical portal, it was something far more dangerous, a tear in the fabric of reality itself, allowing forces that should never be unleashed to seep into the world. "You said I can stop it," Jack said, his voice trembling. "How? What do I need to do?" The figure's voice dropped to a chilling whisper. "The sacrifice must be made. One life for the rest. A life bound to this place. A life tethered to the power you have unleashed. A soul must be given to close the door." Jack's stomach churned. He could feel the weight of the figure's words sinking into his bones. There was no easy way out of this. If he wanted to stop the horror that had been unleashed, if he wanted to save the world, he would have to make an impossible choice. His thoughts turned to Tom, his friend, his brother in all but blood. What had happened to him? Was he still inside that blue energy, still trapped in that form? Or had he already been consumed completely by whatever ancient power had taken hold of him? The figure stepped closer, its cold presence growing more overwhelming. "You must choose, Jack. Your life, or the rest of the world. Your friend is lost. You know this. But you can stop the force that has taken him. You can seal the door, and in doing so, contain what has escaped." Jack clenched his fists, his body trembling with fear and uncertainty. "But how can I?" The words died in his throat. How could he make such a choice? How could he choose to give up his life? Was he truly the one who could stop this, could stop everything, by sacrificing himself? "You cannot stop it with your will alone," the figure said, reading his thoughts. "It is not a matter of strength. It is a matter of giving up that which is most precious. A soul for a soul." The figure reached forward, its hand brushing against Jack's chest, its fingers cold like ice. Jack shuddered, his breath caught in his throat as the world around him seemed to blur. The blue light intensified, and he could hear a low, pulsing hum, like the sound of something ancient and alive. His vision swam. His heart raced. Jack could feel the pull of the energy, pulling at him, demanding his surrender. This was the end of everything he had known, the end of everything that was familiar and safe. But was there another choice? Was there a way out? He looked around at the altar, the glowing stones, the energy swirling through the air. It felt as though the very foundation of reality was shifting, ready to collapse in on itself. Jack could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, suffocating him. His mind screamed for another option, any other option, but deep down, he knew there was no escape. Jack stammered. "I don't know if I can do this." The figure's voice was as cold as death itself. "You must. For the world's survival, for the future, you must." Jack's breath caught in his throat. The weight of the figure's words settled on him like a crushing boulder. If he didn't do this, the door would remain open. The ancient power would spread, consume, and destroy everything in its path. He could see it now, the horror, the chaos. His mind's eye flashed with visions of destruction, of the world as he knew it torn apart by forces beyond comprehension. And it was all because of one single choice. His own life, or the end of everything. Tom's face flashed in his mind again, the anguish in his eyes when Jack had tried to reach him. Tom had never asked for this. He had never signed up to become part of some twisted experiment. But now, Jack was the only one left who could stop it. Tom's fate was sealed, but Jack's wasn't. Not yet. "No," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible as he made the only decision he could. "I won't let it end like this. With those words, he stepped forward into the glowing energy, the power surging around him like a violent storm. He felt his body trembling, the weight of the world pressing on him, but it was too late to turn back. The choice had been made. As the light enveloped him, he thought of Tom. And then, there was nothing but the deafening roar of the energy, and then, silence. The silence that followed was unlike anything Jack had ever felt before. It was as if the universe itself had stopped, frozen in a moment of suspended animation. No sound. No movement. No breath. Just pure stillness, as if the world had been erased from existence. For a moment, Jack thought he had died. That he had crossed into some otherworldly realm. But then the coldness in the air began to dissipate, and the heavy, suffocating feeling that had wrapped around his body started to lift. Jack opened his eyes, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he could see clearly again. The glowing blue light that had surrounded him, that had pulsed through the air like a living entity, had faded into nothingness. The altar, the strange symbols on the walls, the figure that had been looming over him, it was all gone. In its place stood an empty chamber, silent and desolate, as if the very energy that had filled it had evaporated. There was no sign of the figure. No sign of the power that had been so overwhelming moments before. Jack stumbled backward, his legs shaky as though they were no longer his own. He took in deep, ragged breaths, trying to steady himself. Had it worked? Had he sealed the door? Had he stopped whatever nightmare had been unleashed? Or was this just the calm before something far worse? His mind was a fog of confusion and fear. He remembered the choice he had made, the life-or-death decision that had sealed his fate. But was it the right choice? Could he really have stopped it? Jack, a voice whispered, a faint, distant sound that sent a chill down his spine. He turned sharply, his eyes scanning the empty room, but there was no one there. The air was still. No movement. Then, the voice came again. It was faint, yet unmistakably clear. Jack. His heart raced as the voice grew louder, more insistent. It was familiar, but distorted. Torn, as if it were echoing from a distance across time and space. Tom. Jack called out hesitantly, his voice trembling with uncertainty. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the whisper came again, closer now, as if something were drawing nearer. Jack. You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have opened it. Jack's blood ran cold. That voice, it was Tom's. But it wasn't his friend anymore. It was something else. Tom. Jack asked again, stepping forward cautiously. Where are you? The darkness in the room seemed to shift, the shadows stretching unnaturally as though they were alive, moving with a mind of their own. The air grew colder again, and Jack could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. A shadow detached itself from the wall and began to grow, its form becoming more solid, more defined. Jack's breath caught in his throat as the figure took shape before him. It was Tom, or at least, it looked like him. His face was gaunt, hollowed out, the eyes dark and unblinking, empty voids. His body was unnaturally thin, as though life had been drained from him, leaving only a hollow shell. Tom, Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. He reached out, his hand trembling. What happened to you? Tom's lips curled into a twisted smile, and Jack's stomach twisted in response. The smile was not his friend's smile. It was something dark. Evil. You failed, Jack, Tom's voice rasped. It wasn't Tom's voice anymore, it was something deeper, more menacing. You couldn't stop it. You opened the door. You let it out. Jack stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure that had once been Tom took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it was being pulled by unseen forces. Jack's mind raced, he had made the sacrifice. He had chosen to give himself, to seal the door, to stop the energy. But Tom was standing here, a twisted reflection of what he had been. And that voice, there was no mistaking it, was something far darker than anything Jack had ever imagined. "Tom, please," Jack pleaded, his voice shaking with desperation. "This isn't you. This isn't what you wanted." Tom's form began to flicker, as if he were a projection, an image wavering in and out of focus. His body shimmered with the same eerie blue light that had surrounded the room before, and for a moment, Jack felt the ground beneath him shift, as though reality itself was warping around him. "You don't understand, Jack," Tom's voice echoed. "You never understood. The door was never meant to be closed. You sealed it, yes. But you also unlocked something else." Jack's mind raced. What was Tom trying to tell him? What had he really unleashed? Was this some twisted aftereffect of the experiment? Or was it something much worse, something beyond comprehension? Before Jack could respond, the ground beneath him shook violently, knocking him off balance. The chamber seemed to tremble, the walls crackling as if they were alive. "No," Tom's voice hissed. "You can't stop it now. It's too late." The figure lunged at him, and Jack barely managed to stumble back, his heart racing as the shadows seemed to close in around him. The air grew thick with a menacing energy, the same energy that had consumed Tom, that had altered everything. Jack knew he couldn't escape. The walls began to crack and crumble, and the glow from the altar intensified again, brighter than before. Jack's body froze, the realization hitting him with crushing force. It wasn't over. The door had been closed, yes. But something had been set free. Something far worse than he had ever imagined. As the shadows consumed him, Jack felt his body weakening, his breath shallow, his mind spiraling. The price he had paid had not been enough. And now, the true terror was about to be unleashed. And in the end, there would be no escape. Not for Jack, not for Tom, and certainly not for the world. Jack's eyes snapped open, and for a brief, fleeting moment, he thought he was waking from a nightmare. But the overwhelming pressure on his chest and the cold emptiness in the air told him otherwise. He was still trapped. The room was now in total darkness, the once intense glow replaced by an eerie quiet that was more suffocating than any sound could be. A low hum vibrated through the air, deep and resonant, as if the very foundation of reality was trembling. Jack tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, as though they were submerged in thick mud. His pulse thudded in his ears, each beat echoing louder than the last. "Jack." The voice, Tom's voice, whispered again, but this time it was different. It wasn't taunting, like before. It was hollow, desperate. It echoed in the stillness, curling into Jack's mind like a whisper in the dark. "Tom." Jack croaked, barely able to get the words out. He pushed himself up with what little strength he had left, his body trembling. The darkness around him seemed to close in, but then, just as suddenly, the shadows seemed to split, revealing the blue light again, pulsing in the distance. He staggered toward it, the hum growing louder, more insistent, the temperature in the room dropping with each step. His breath came in shallow gasps as the blue glow grew stronger, illuminating a scene that Jack could never have imagined. The altar, still standing, still glowing with the same cursed energy, was now surrounded by figures. They stood perfectly still, their faces hidden in shadow. Their presence was suffocating, like they were the very essence of the darkness itself, feeding off of the energy that surged around them. Tom stood among them, his form flickering in and out of existence. His eyes were hollow, as they had been before, but now they burned with an unnatural intensity. He seemed to be staring directly at Jack, but his gaze wasn't one of recognition or familiarity. It was cold. Detached. Empty. "Jack," Tom's voice came again, louder now, though still distant. "You failed." "No, no. Jack shouted, his voice breaking. I did everything I could. I sealed the door. I closed it. Tom's form flickered again, and with it, the blue light surged. The door was never the real problem. It was you. It was always you. Jack's mind reeled. What was Tom talking about? The figure, the creature, had spoken of a sacrifice, a price to pay, but had he truly made the right choice? Had he done enough? You can't fix this, Jack, Tom continued, his voice distorting with a dark, eerie laughter. The door is open. It can't be closed again. The power has already escaped. There's no going back. You'll never be free. Jack's heart raced as he looked around the chamber. The figures surrounding the altar were beginning to move, slowly at first, but with increasing speed, as though something, some ancient force, was awakening in them. No! Jack screamed, his voice filled with pure terror. He backed away, his body trembling with the overwhelming realization. I can stop it. I can still stop it. But it was too late. The ground beneath him shook violently, the entire room vibrating as the walls cracked open like a web of spider veins. The blue light flared again, bright and blinding, and Jack felt himself being drawn toward it, as though something outside of him was pulling him in. No, Jack whispered, his voice filled with horror. I can't. Before he could finish his thought, a blinding light enveloped him, and the world around him shattered into pieces. Jack awoke with a gasp, his heart pounding in his chest. The world around him was normal again. Quiet. Still. The early morning light filtered through the window, casting soft rays across the floor. The familiar hum of the outside world, the birds chirping, the distant sound of traffic, filled his ears. He was in his bed. Safe. For a moment, Jack thought he had woken up from a terrible dream, but as his gaze shifted to the window, a cold, sick feeling washed over him. There, standing in the snow outside, was a figure. It was him. But it wasn't. The figure was tall, covered in a tattered red and white cloak. Its face was obscured by a dark hood, but Jack knew, he knew who it was. The coldness in its stance, the eerie stillness, made it clear. The figure raised its head, and Jack could see the faint outline of a twisted smile beneath the hood. It was the figure from the chamber. The one who had spoken of sacrifice. The one who had brought Tom to this fate. The one who had changed everything. The door had never truly closed. Jack's breath caught in his throat as the figure raised a hand, pointing directly at him, its shadow stretching across the snow. A chill ran down his spine, and his blood ran cold. It was not over. The terror, the darkness, had followed him. It had never left. And now, it was coming for him. As the figure's smile widened, Jack's world plunged into the deepest, most suffocating darkness he had ever known. The curse was complete. The door had not only opened, it had consumed everything. And there was no escape.